Awesome. So why don't we get started, and that way anybody comes in late, you can all tell those people how awesome the first 5 minutes of the presentation was. Oh.
So just remember to repeat any questions you get for the live streamers.
Sure. Okay, fair enough. Just remember, the first 5 minutes presentation, you've never heard anything that good. You tell that to anybody that comes in late. So anyway, this is a class it's called Teaching Perl for Advocacy and Fun. And I taught a class for Perl beginners end of last year. And I taught the class because I really believe that Perl is a great language. And if we would manage to be able to communicate the value of Perl better, we not only bring more people to the language, which is good for all of us, and those new people would come in with all their great ideas and make Perl even better for the next group of people coming in. And I try to blog about it and do CPAN modules and educate. Finally, we always keep talking about, hey, we should do more teaching. We should do more. Well, okay, I'm going to teach. So I taught a class. And I just give a quick couple call-outs. I want to thank my company, Shutterstock. All the images, with the exception of 2, which I will point out in this presentation, are from our collection of images. And also, we're hiring. I'm being asked to say that. So that's jobs, MHTML. So that tells you we're using Perl, right? I also want to give a shout-out to General Assembly. That's the place where I taught the class. I appreciate them giving me a space and to help me with advertising and getting people to come in and all that. So that was really great. Go check out their website. I also, a couple more shout-outs. I appreciate Chromatic and the community for Modern Perl, the book. My students used it. It was great that it was free in EPUB, and they were so excited to see it on GitHub and to know that it was a collaborative project. It's just one of those things that makes Perl look like a really modern, happening place and not just stuff that people write crappy admin scripts in. Also, just the Perl org community in general for doing so much over the last few years to get us to the point where I could actually teach this class and not be completely like on my own from top to bottom in how to teach Perl. Okay, so end of the love fest. Let's hear what sucks about Perl. Don't be shy.
Access.
Keep going.
No other implementations.
No implementations. Come on. Ow. Come on. Keep going.
I'm serious.
All right. Let's hear more. Toolchain. Perl 6. Okay. So somebody said Perl 6, the P5P channel, the XS components. What else? Version numbers. Not enough people working. Ow. Okay. More. I'm sorry? Python. All right. So, no good grammars. I'm sorry, what? Oh, let's not name people. Okay, come on. No one uses it. Okay.
It doesn't run on my computer.
It doesn't run on Windows. Okay.
It doesn't run on my
my computer, period. Ow. Or it's not good for mobile. You guys are great. You came up with more things than my students did. So I started my first class that way. The only difference is I actually had a board, and when they shouted out, they had to go up and write down what they wanted and what they were thinking. And why did I start my first class that way? It's a little amusing, but I have a kind of a point to it. I believe if you're going to teach, you need to understand where somebody is coming from. You can't just pour stuff into them. You got to know what they're thinking. And I really wanted to get at their ideas. When I say Perl, they came to the class, so they must be interested for some reason. But they got to have some lurking hesitancies. And if I'm going to teach Perl, I need to know what those are because the class has to be about that. I don't believe that teaching is about just pouring stuff into people's heads. That's not teaching. I think teaching is about inspiring people. And when I say, for me, what is inspiration is I do something and somebody else, they hear what I'm saying and they form their own feeling about it. Now, they're not going to form the exact same thing in my head. I can't take what's in my head and put it into their heads. But I can communicate something in such a way that gets them to create their own cool ideas about what we're talking about. And it's something that's meaningful to themselves within their own life context, within their own problem context. And I think that for me, teaching is about that. And I think Perl is a really fantastic language for working on problems because it's a language that really does get contextual and can work with a lot of different viewpoints. So I think it's, for me, my feeling about teaching really connects strongly with why I like being a Perl programmer. So I was saying, like, I think I need to inspire people to create their own ideas, and they help them to form those ideas into something real. And then, of course, along the way, I want to make sure that I help guide them so that as they try to make their idea real in the world, we don't create a big mess to get it to actually work. So as part of being a teacher, you want to inspire and you want to give a little mentoring, a little guidance so that they just don't get so far off the path that it's a lot of unlearning, or they write a lot of, like, well, what we would call like messy code, right? So how do I go about doing that? I think for inspiration, I think you got to surprise people from time to time. Because they might think, wow, I didn't know you could do that with Perl. I think it's good to help people connect things. People remember things better when they're connected. Like the ancient Greeks, whenever they would go memorize like speeches, because they didn't have teleprompters, right? So they would have to memorize a speech, and the way they did it is they would all, like as part of their education and being a debater, they would stare at like a wall and they would memorize each crack, each crack connected to like a spot on the wall, and that spot connected to a piece of graffiti. And they would memorize that entire string, and when they went to go work on their speech, because they had that like whole like big idea, like picture in their head, they could put their different points in each one of those spots. And then that helped them to remember. And I think that like learning is that way, is you just can't throw out like a bunch of stuff at the wall. People are going to tune out. They're going to forget it. It's better to throw out a couple ideas and show how each idea is connected as you move along, because people will remember that. And I also think you need to like show those connections very carefully. So like you start with a simple idea, and then you teach them something new, and you say, okay, what I'm teaching you now is a little like what I just taught you, but here's the little twist, right? And then you go on to the third thing. It's just like what I just taught you, but here's another little twist. That way people, again, they remember it, they see the connections. So you get the inspiration, you get the surprise, and you move things along. So just a little divergence. I added this slide based on our keynote. And who recognizes this? Raise your hand. Okay. So keep them up. I didn't say put them down. Can you, those of you who got your hands up, can you look around the room and see like the number? Okay, there are a couple people that did not raise their hands, right? Okay. So, okay, you can put them down now. Oh, website. We'll keep them up for a second. If you've seen the movie more than once, all right, more than 10 times? I just wanted to know. Okay, you can put it down. All right. So, I'm sorry, what? Can you taunt me now? No. You can taunt me after the presentation on IRC, because I'm going to be gone. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, this is a movie by Monty Python, and amongst people who are programmers, particularly from a very specific context, these happen to be movies that we've watched. And a lot of us have watched. In fact, most of us. Probably 10 years ago, everyone would have raised their hands. Okay? This year, a couple people didn't raise their hands. I want to point out to all of you here, 10 years from now, the number of hands are going to be a lot lower. Okay? And so I guess what I'm trying to get at here is when you're teaching, you have to think hard about the context in which how you're communicating your ideas. Because if all you're talking about is Monty Python, that's going to fly today, but it's not going to fly tomorrow. And it's also going to cut out a lot of people that don't come from the same specific Western cultural context that we have. And that's like a humongous part of the world. In fact, it's the majority of the world. And I also, just again playing from some of the thoughts from our keynote, if all your examples are like Jack and Jill, Srinivas is not going to feel good. Okay, so just please keep that in mind as a teacher. I understand you want to play. Sometimes people when they're teaching, they want to act like they're cool, so they'll pull out popular stuff. Just think a little bit about it, because you might be referring to context and giving examples that may not be fully understood by everybody in your audience and might feel a little bit hostile. So that's something to keep in mind. Anyway, no more lecturing. So let's get to the fun part. So first class. Again, I said, I don't actually think I can actually teach people anything, but maybe I can inspire people. And so that's why I want the first class to be very fun. So for a good part of the rest of this presentation, I want to just give you a quick summary of what I did in the first class, and then I'll give you a sort of a summary of what we did afterwards and how it ended. So just to give you an idea of what I mean, what for me is fun, and for me what I hope is inspiring. And I hope that there's some things here that are a little surprising to you as things that should be taught in the beginner pro class on day one. So baby talk. I remember when I first started using Perl, one of the things that I had heard was that Perl is a language that you could do something useful and competent even if you knew very little. In other words, you could actually get a lot done in Baby Talk Perl. And I think that's pretty cool. And that's something that I communicate to my students, that it's fine to just to play with the language. Children don't learn to talk perfectly. They learn to talk because they're willing to play with words and sounds, right? So let's make sure that when we are seeing people when they're starting off with their Baby Talk Perl, help correct them, but don't shut them down, because that's where they're starting from. And it's just a great thing about our language that you can be that way. Like other languages, you can't. Baby Talk Python? No. Okay, right? I'm sorry, what was that? Okay, let's not get into language debates. Okay, so this was the first thing that I showed them, because Perl starts at the command line, right? And I know there might be a few things in here that might be a little controversial, but I just chose stuff that I thought was decent to begin with. So I taught people, this is a command line application, and I actually ran it so they could see that I would type in my name, and bang, it would say, hello, my name. So in other words, it demonstrated, although this is a very simple application, I think it actually demonstrates a lot. It demonstrates stuff about standard input and standard output, and it talks about how to use a Perl module, and it's a basic script. I mean, there's a lot going on in here, and I could probably spend the whole rest of this talk just talking about this. Of course, when they saw it, they were a little, scared. So this was the reaction, and that's why I went through, and I probably spent a good 20 minutes just line by line or character by character basically explaining what that was. I talked about that Perl was a command interpreter. What does that mean? I got a little bit into what does it mean to be a dynamic language. I answered questions about that. People asked me, what's the difference between the Java and other things. So it was great. People spawned off thoughts, and we just went on about that. I talked about the command line switches you get with Perl. I mentioned a little bit about the module. There was that modern Perl, that M modern Perl. What does that mean? It means that Perl is a modular language. That's one of the greatest things about Perl, is that we have this massive open source repository, and you can just grab stuff. And I spent a lot of time talking about standard input and standard output, because for me, standard in, standard out, that's one of those things that I said before about, you start with a basic concept, and then you build upon it as you go through your slides, you go through your thing. Standard input and standard output is like a basic concept that programs use. And it's interpreted and used in different ways. It's used one way from a command line. And it's a little bit different when you get to a web server. But in general, they're similar enough that if you understand one, then you can migrate up to understanding the next piece later on. I also got a chance to talk a little bit about implicit arguments. I was really freaking nervous about implicit arguments, the add underscore stuff. I thought that was going to be something the students had a lot of trouble with and would get confused about. So I probably talked about that a lot. As it turned out, it was one of the things they loved, so that surprised me. So then anyway, I took that and I said, okay, that's great. We have a one-liner, and if that's all the Perl you ever do and it's useful to you, that's awesome. But if you want to take it to the next level, let's write it as a script. So I took the same thing and I wrote it as a script, basically. So, and I got a chance to talk about what this meant, what the shebang was, and now that was put together. I spent a few minutes saying you might see some shebangs with usabin Perl as opposed to usabin in Perl, and kind of said you should do it this way and why. And a little bit about, again, implicit arguments, and now that got put together. I mentioned modern Perl. I know that may not be, again, that may be amongst this group, maybe one of the more controversial concepts, but what I wanted is an easy way for people who are coming to Perl to activate a modern Perl environment, and maybe there's a better option now, but back in November, it seemed to me like one of the better ones to make sure the strict and warnings and all those basic things were put into place. So, you could all hit me up later with your better ideas about it, but it was easy for them to remember because I called the class Modern Perl, so I said use Modern Perl. They even thought I wrote it, which I didn't. I didn't correct them. Although afterwards I showed them the CPAN, they found out that I didn't write it. So then here I ran the script, and again I did it interactively, and for the purposes of saving a little time, I won't keep jumping back and forth to a term, but I'm sure you can all imagine in your head, right, how that would work. They were happy to see that. So we went from the command line, we wrote it as a script. Okay, let's bump it up a notch. Okay. Now, I'm teaching Moose and objects in the very first Perl class. Okay. I think, and I was a little, again, this is something I was nervous about. I thought maybe they would have trouble. But actually, they understood most of this right off the top. And it looked really cool. Like people were immediately, there were 2 people in the class that actually had heard of Moose already. That's something that was cool about Perl. And we ended up talking about objects. So I spent a few moments explaining what objects are. And I just gave them the simple concept. It's objects are data with some behaviors wrapped around them. And we do that because it makes it so that you can hide the way the data works and you can change implementation without breaking all your code. And it's a fundamental unit of code reusability in modern programming. And I just stopped there. You can continue to argue about it. You can say functional programming is better. But for the purpose of the class, it worked for them. And like I said, if you're saying use Moose, you don't need to say use monoperl because use Moose turns the same thing on, which we all know it doesn't do exactly the same thing, but it does enough of the same thing that I could say that. And they understood what attributes were, and obviously required, and the RO read-only. That's once I explained it, it jumped right out. I talked a little bit about subroutines. Most of the people in the class, even though they had not used Perl, they had done a little bit of programming, so the concept of a subroutine was already something they knew. And they'd known a little bit about objects from other programming languages. So they weren't complete programming newbies in my class, so that did help me a little bit. But I went right to it with the object because I thought that it was important to get people, like I said, I want people to get the idea, but I want to get them going right from the beginning. And even though there's a lot of stuff here that they may not fully get, it's enough like what I just showed them that they could see the connection, okay? And, how would we use it? I say, well, when you write something as a class, now you can reuse it. Unlike a script, it can only do one thing. Once you've written it as a class, you could use it in multiple contexts. So here's a script that uses what we just did and works basically the same way as the script we just did 5 minutes or 10 minutes earlier, but it's now as a class, so it's now reusable. Everybody thought that was awesome. Okay, even though it's a little more code, but they could see the advantage. And also at this point, there were people in the class who were like, "Wow, Moose and Perl, the language it looks more attractive than I had been led to believe." So I think it looks nice, but I know people have different feelings. Anyway, and so anyway, again we ran it and it worked the same way. Again, I wanted to teach objects right off the top because I wanted people to have a concept of building blocks. One of the most important parts of Perl is that we encourage people to think of your applications as CPAN modules, whether you're going to put them on CPAN or not. You should write your applications that way as reusable bits of stuff, okay? And so think about building blocks right from the beginning. And if you don't totally get objects, you can cargo cult a lot of stuff and actually maybe talk your way through a lot of it as well. So this is the first slide that Shutterstock didn't. I probably shouldn't show it. I don't have copyright to this. But, you can't read that, can you? It says those were the droids you were looking for, if you can't see it. Now, I guess I probably shouldn't be using a Star Wars thing, but I guess it's pretty well known in the world, right? I don't want my students to regret later on that when they write a lot of code and they're down the path and they've probably written, maybe a couple thousand lines of code, if they haven't been given like the right conceptual tools, they will have written a big mess, and then they're going to be regretful. Anyway, another thing that was great about writing stuff as a class is that, now you can write a test case. So I taught them test cases in class 1. And again, there were some things here they hadn't seen before, but basic Perl testing is pretty simple, really. I got an opportunity to talk a little bit about the package names, and, when you want to use something, you say use it. All right, that's pretty obvious. And the test cases are assertions. In this case, I'm saying is something something. That was also pretty understandable to them. And this was a great opportunity to step back and say, hey, you wrote something as a class, as a reusable piece of stuff. You were able to use it for your script, and now you can also write a test case for it. Okay, so that was also, in other words, you could write better code right from the beginning if you do it that way. And they liked it in general. They liked the idea, how that went together. And I showed them how the test case run from the command line. Then, again, I wanted to bump it up one level. Got the same class. Let's write a website. I asked everybody in the room who had written a website before. And in Perl, nobody rose their hand with that. And so I showed them Plaque. And I'm going to assume most of us in this room here are familiar enough with Plaque that this will be meaningful to them, to all of you. But they were psyched that you could write a Perl website in a few lines of code. Like, somebody in the class actually said, I'm paraphrasing it, I don't have to spend 3 days compiling Apache and mod Perl to be able to like write applications for Perl that sit on the web. And I said, no, all you need to do is return a subref, okay? I didn't call it that. I said, it has to look like this. And this has to be the thing at the end. And then later on, when we talked about web development, I talked about anonymous subrefs and so forth. I said, hey, here you go. You got your, that same class that we wrote earlier on. Now we're going to repurpose it yet again. We use it as a script. We put in a test case. Now we're going to put it on the Internet, okay? And I spent a moment just talking about what Plaque was and how simple it is. And this was also a great opportunity to talk about standard input and standard output for the web because, you can think of HTTP in the standard input, standard output manner. The only thing you need to think about is that with the web, you have the HTTP header, so that's a little bit of additional metadata. So that's sort of how I explained it. I said it's just the same thing, except there's a little bit of extra stuff there, metadata stuff, and think of them as almost two separate parts of the message, right? And so they were able to build upon what I taught them about standard input and standard output from the script example and bring that over to the Internet. And then we started up the application. I think I have it running here. Let's see. Oh, I got that one running. Sorry. At this point, they noticed that I was using Plackup as opposed to Perl. And they were like, how come you didn't use Perl? And so I stopped and explained what Plackup was as basically a wrapper around the Perl interpreter that created a web context. I didn't say anything more than that. And I got the opportunity to talk to them about Perl Doc, or they go to CPAN and look up stuff. So if you ran into anything about Perl that you wanted to know about, here are the two resources that Perl programmers generally use in order to find out the answers to those. And they all wrote down metacpan.org to go look up things. So that worked out pretty well. And, okay, here's the running website. It would look like this. Okay. At the end of the first class, I knew that there were a lot of people that were auditing the class. They only signed up for class one. They only paid for one class. So on the assumption that people might not come back, I spent the last chunk of the class talking about where they could go to learn more. I pointed them at the Modern Perl book. I talked about Task Kensho. Everybody know what Task Kensho is? You know what it is. Stand up and tell people. Okay. Just simply, Task Kensho is, the way I described it is, a bunch of modules. We know that on CPAN there's a lot of different ways to do things. Task Kensho is an attempt to write down ways to do common things, like build web applications and send emails, that you probably won't get laughed at if you used. Okay. But there may be other options. You may find things you like better. But if you use those things, no one's going to say you're stupid. And I pointed them at Perl.org. I gave them a list of additional books and talked about IRC. I said that although there are a lot of mailing lists, for better or worse, the Perl community seems to use IRC mostly for talking and so forth, and that I encourage them to go there and to be to become part of it. So that was sort of the end of the first class. For the remaining classes, I tried to build upon that. I talked about, in the second class, I talked about Perl history, and I spent time teaching people how to install Perl. I then taught a class on what I thought of as the minimum syntax you needed to know. I actually did teach them more Perl than I knew in my first paying job. At my first paying job, I didn't actually even know how to write a Perl subroutine, so I taught them how to write subs. They already knew it, but so I taught them basic syntax, different kind of variable constructs, the difference between a hash and an array, and how they're similar in some ways and different in other ways, and I gave them a lot of examples. And then I went on, and we went on to build an application. We started building an application that we then stuck with building that application for the rest of the class. I think that worked really well because it provided a sort of continuity from that class going forward. Basically, I started with who here's interviewed at Shutterstock? I didn't interview you, did I? When I interview at Shutterstock, I give a kind of a quiz to people to build a small application. So we basically built that application together, and we kind of grew it over time, and we worked on it, and we tried to make it better and to make it follow community standards. I did a class on the most common solutions or commonly accepted solutions to common problems, like opening files and parsing CVS data, and scraping stuff from the internet. And I introduced DBI, and I talked about a little bit about DBI's class as well, just to talk about databases. So I went through those things, and I gave them. It was kind of a whirlwind tour. It might have been actually one of the less successful classes because I think I covered too much. I did spend an entire class eventually talking about objects, but within the context of the application that we were writing together. And the seventh class was like a workshop. We just all played with the little app, and I kind of challenged everybody to make weird different things with it to see what they come up with. I spent the last class talking about all the stuff that they shouldn't do, that they'll probably see in code they have to work on and get paid for. So that was also, I just wanted them, I wanted them to know, like, they're going to see, bare file handles, and they're going to see, like, a lot of, like, bad use of eval. They're going to see that if they get jobs in Perl, they're going to see some of that crappy code, and they have to know what it is, and they need to be able to at least talk about it intelligently. I just want to say that I had a guest lecturer in the class on Taz Kensho. He's sitting over here. We can all point at him. Everybody point at him. It worked out really well. It was serendipitous, but it was just like, it was great to have a guest lecturer. The application we wrote is on GitHub, if anybody wants to go take a look at it. It's probably woefully over-engineered for the problem that we're trying to solve. But in a way, it's kind of, sometimes it's like useful to take some simple problem and try to like apply every possible best practice to it, even if it makes no sense, just to kind of see where it leads you. At the end, I left them with the feeling. I talked about Larry Wall and how he didn't come really from a computer background, he had a linguist background, and like he said, Perl is supposed to be evolving, and I told him, I'm really glad that we're bringing new people into the Perl community because you're all going to bring new interesting ideas, and you're going to challenge like our probably broken paradigms and hopefully improve it. Perl evolves, it changes, okay, and it's up to the next generation people come in and change it in a way that makes sense. Terry Pratchett, who's one of my favorite authors, he had this. He talked a lot about how like people needed to be involved in a community. He said you need to bounce around, like he called it a Brownian motion machine of society in order for something to stay fresh and relevant. And I just think like open source is like that. If the code is not bouncing around like people, like a lot of different people, it's eventually going to like get stale and become broken. I think that's why open source is great and almost always is going to win over proprietary applications because unless a company is spending a huge amount of money on something, it's going to be very difficult for them to keep the code like fresh and relevant and keep bouncing it around. Let me give you a little bit of the feedback I got from the students. Things that surprised me, they liked the implicit arguments and they liked implicit return. They thought that was cool. They were neutral on the syntax. They didn't have strong negatives or positive feelings about sigils. And they were just fine with it. They weren't like totally in love with it, but I didn't hear like lots of negative stuff either. They appreciated things like CPAN, local lib, and ProBro. They could see that those were tools that people had written to help solve problems that they were having learning Perl and using Perl. And they could even in some cases see how those were tools that were useful in their companies. Plaque was a big hit. It's just the fact that they could write a web application in a few lines of code. Like we wrote a web application together in 5 lines of code, and they're like thinking, you did that in 5 lines of code. If I did 10 lines of code, it would be twice as good, and it's still only 10 lines of code. That's amazing. And I didn't have to install anything. It's just a code ref, And they liked Moose. They liked a lot of the tools. We, in the class when we worked on our application, I talked a lot about like how you could use attributes and do delegation, not just inheritance, but you could do roles. I talked about delegation. I talked about using roles as like creating an interface. We actually, for our guestbook application, we actually built 2 backends. We built one backend that was an in-memory storage, and we built a database backend. And we were able to do that with Moose in our application and not have to change any code. It was just a configuration option to switch between the two. And it was easy. And it was something that people who were just learning Perl could understand. So it really was a major hit. Things that were difficult, they did still have trouble installing Perl, and they did bump into problems installing CPAN modules. Conceptually, local lib was a little difficult. I probably re-explained it several times in order to fully get it. I know that now Perl Brew can install CPAN-M and it has local lib built into it, so that's definitely going to help. When I taught the class last year, there were separate tools that had to be installed separately, okay, in order to be able to get going with it. So that was a little more troublesome for them. I was able to eventually get them, in our application we built a make file to properly manage our dependencies, and they could use that and they could see how it could work. But it was still a little bit more difficult to get off the top. They appreciated that the Pro community was doing a better effort at making good documentation and doing things like the Modern Pro book, which would be free as an EPUB, and it's on GitHub. But in comparison to like the learning tools for other languages, we still have work to do. It wasn't a criticism. They were just simply pointing out, we see that, a lot of work has been done, particularly in the last just even 1 or 2 years, but we're still not quite there yet with that. That's just honest feedback. So what would I change about my class if I was going to do it again? I'm hoping to do it again this summer. I don't think I'd change the first class. The first class was awesome. I had tremendous fun. And another thing I always tell teachers, if you're going to be a teacher, if you're not enjoying it, then either don't teach or teach differently. If you're not enjoying the class, they're not enjoying listening to you, right? So, and I'm not saying don't be nervous and stuff. That's fine. That's like human. But if you're having a bad time, they're definitely having a bad time. So I wouldn't really change the class. The second class, I think I should have focused just on getting Perl installed. I did a lot of stuff where I talked about the history of Perl and all that. And at the time, I thought it was valuable, but now I'm thinking back. When I first started programming Perl, I didn't know anything about Perl history, and it wasn't important. Things that really were tripping them up were like getting Perl installed, and I should have spent the whole class just on that. I ended up spilling over into the third class, and I got tons of emails from my students about the continuing trouble getting Perl installed, and I'm glad that enough of them stuck with it. For the third class, it was really dry because I was just I was basically just saying, here's what arrays look like, and here's what hashes look like. I didn't provide a fun context in which to learn the things. I just thought it would be I'd throw them up on the wall and we'd move on. I guess if I was going to do it again, I think I would probably find a script, like an old script that I wrote that maybe isn't particularly great, but it had a lot of different stuff in it, and just go through it and explain how it worked. I needed to provide some sort of a build context. And the fact that I went and for the third class going forward, we started building an application together, and we stayed with that for the rest of the class. Was my feeling at the end of this class is that this was just too dry. So something to think about. I mean, if you're going to be teaching class for an hour and it's going to be, just spend some minutes thinking about the material. I could have made better use of social media. My students did email me, but I don't know. I could have got the stuff up on GitHub more quickly. I could have done more with Facebook or Twitter or any of those things. It would have had an impact beyond our small group, I think. The guest lecturer thing was a hit. They loved having that, and I would do it again. I would recommend do even more. In fact, following up on the keynote, think about if you're having guest lecturer, maybe have guest lecturers that are not like yourself, so people get different viewpoints. Okay, I have to say system Perl, minus, man. When I was teaching them how to install Perl, every time they had trouble installing Perl or using CPAN or something, I went over to their computer and looked at it. It was because they weren't doing what I told them to do, which was pretend the system Perl wasn't there. They were trying to short-circuit what I was telling them to do, which is install Perl from scratch using Perl Brew and do these other things. They're I don't really need to do that. I already got Perl installed. I'm going to bypass. And then they would get into trouble. Just the fact that it's there is just screwing people up. If you teach a class in Perl, you just shout it. Pretend the system Perl is not there. It's not useful for development. It's there for system use. If you try to short-circuit what I'm teaching you here and just use a system Perl and you're going to install modules into your global directory or install some into global directory and some into your local lib, it's going to break and you're going to be unhappy and then you're going to raise your hand and ask me to help you. And, anyway, just my rant. I kind of feel like I probably should have done more handouts and takeaways. I didn't because I'm we're not in the modern age. Do people want paper handouts? I think I probably should have. I should have given them something with you know, the URLs and addresses and things written on it, particularly for the people who came to the first class that audited and didn't come back. It would have been great. It may have helped them if they wanted to continue to learn on their own. Something else that I did, one thing that my students said to me was they appreciated that the Perl community tried to write modules in the Unix way. In other words, where we try to write small independent modules that are standalone and then try to work with like the idea of standard input and standard output, you know, through simple interfaces, okay? And that as a programmer, your job is to take a bunch of things and put them together into an application. They appreciated that, but they all said it's a little hard. And if you look at like other languages, you know, for example, other frameworks like whether it's Rails or Drupal or somebody, you know, some of the other PHP frameworks, they do give you a bigger stack out of the box. Now, as Perl programmers, we also disdain that and say, well, that big stack is going to eventually get in your way. Okay? Okay, maybe that's true, maybe it's not. Okay? But the truth is, it would be great that for some simple, basic types of problems that everybody faces, perhaps giving, you know, more Kool-Aid option for learners to be able to do this certain types of things so they could get started, okay? And then make the code not be such a full stack that they can't break it apart and then go forward and do something else. So I wrote a DBS class migration based on my experience with teaching. DBS class migration is a tool that works with DBS class and helps create migrations from basically versions of your database, and also fixture sets. And it integrates with Catalyst and integrates with testing tools. So it's kind of a bigger stack than in general we're used to doing. Okay, and I know it's a somewhat controversial concept. Also, I didn't just write API level docs. I wrote a long tutorial, like how to use it from the beginning, how to integrate it with your test cases, how to integrate it with Catalyst, and a big example like that. I did that because my students were giving me the feeling that that's really what they wanted more of that. They didn't want Perl to become like Drupal or those things. They liked that Perl was independent, and they could see that that's how CPAN is able to scale the way it does, because we try to do a lot of small things well rather than try to do one humongous thing. Okay? Generally, those huge projects don't fly so well in Perl because we don't get enough stickiness to keep them going. But lots and lots of little projects that are smart and work together, they're able to be maintained. So this was my stab at trying to cut the difference a little bit and offer people who wanted to do, like, work with a database and need to work with versioning, to give them something that's not as much Kool-Aid as like Rails migrations, active migrations, but maybe more than what you get out of the box with DBX class and some of the other tools, right? This is just something to help get them started. And I'm trying it out, and let's see how it goes, you know. So that was a takeaway that I tried to act on. So we're kind of coming to the end here. Can somebody dim the lights? Just dim the lights. I'm going to tell a story. Okay. Okay. Oh. Okay, right, fine. Good enough. Okay. That's fine. One more time. Okay, anyway. Okay, so not in my current job, at a previous job, I was in a company that was really psyched about Perl. And we were using modern Perl. Like, we were using Catalyst and we were using Moose. We were using, DBS class and a lot of other projects that we're seeing. And we wrote our application like a CPAN module. We did all those things that you're supposed to do. And we all loved Perl. We thought Perl was great. And I remember my boss was sitting there and he was on the phone to one of his friends who was not a technology person but wanted to learn programming. He was a manager, or she was a manager, I'm not sure, and was feeling like they wanted to learn programming so that they could speak better to their programmers, right? They just wanted to, learn enough so that they could be on the same level. And that person was asking my boss, like, how can I write Perl applications? And I could see, like, the look of anguish on my boss's face was just like, it killed me. And I could feel it too. He was a Perl newbie, somebody who knew very little about programming, but was smart and was involved in technology, wanted to learn Perl. And at that point in time, we did not feel that we could say, yes, here's something you could go do and learn. We just weren't there, it's really, really, really sucked that, he was like, well, I guess you could look at some Python stuff because there's tons of documentation for Python. Python focuses on learning. That's just the truth, right? And after you put that on the phone, it's like, that sucked. I can't tell somebody that it's easy to learn Perl, and I couldn't disagree with him at the time. But I feel better now. We can turn the lights up. Turn them on now. I feel better. I think we have a long way to go. We're still in the infancy in many ways, but I think it's more hopeful. I was able to teach a Perl class, and I had help. I didn't need to do it on my own. There were resources, right? And there were cool things on CPAN that I could pull out. And there were cool things like Plaque and Moose and other tools that I could show them that got the students excited. They were like, I could do that in Perl? I can't do that in some other language. And they, like CPAN-M, local lib, think tools that were there, like Perl Brew, make it easy to install Perl. They appreciated those things. We are now at a place where I could teach a class in Perl, and you could teach a class in Perl, and not have to just feel inferior about it. You could go with it. Questions? Did I talk at all about regular expressions? I did briefly cover regular expressions. I'm not a regular expression foo master, and for the type of problems that we were working on for our application, it wasn't that important to be able to do. But I didn't cover it, and there was no specific slight or reason not to, other than I felt I didn't have time. Other questions? Go. So the question is how to find Perl jobs?
No, why is it hard to find Perl jobs, and at the same time it's hard to hire Perl jobs?
Well, hard to find Perl jobs. We're hiring. And the flip side of that is when your boss says, let's kill Perl and use Java, Ruby, Node.js, PHP, I don't know, whatever, because I can't hire any more Perl programmers. I think we should take it seriously, okay, because I just recognize there are people that know Perl, but the number of people that are really good at Perl is probably not as high as we would like to be. So let's just be honest about it. But what I try to come back is I have two things I come back to is you have to ask yourself, how many Perl programmers does the company really need? How many programmers? 100? I don't know. 200. Are there not 200 Perl programmers in the world that you could say? Really, like they say, it's hard to find. Yes, it's hard to find good programmers in general, and that's how we always say it. But the truth is, if you think about the numbers, you should be able. It's doable. I think it's a problem also that's getting better because we're doing better advocacy. I see a lot more younger people coming from different backgrounds. I think Perl is more learnable, which is the second comeback. I would give to my bosses that Perl is more learnable, and people don't have don't have the same it's a Duke Nukem of languages anymore kind of thing. I'm not seeing that as much, so I think it's possible that we can bring in smart people who are good at other languages and bring them over. My understanding is Booking.com does that in some cases. I'm not sure if that's true. Is anything from Booking.com that can verify that? No? Okay. Nobody from Booking.com came to my talk? Oh, you did. So do you bring in people from other languages and teach them? Do you have an internal program? Okay, I'm not going to ask you to give away any secrets. I wanted to have verification for that.
I'm not really working for Booking anymore, but anyway, Booking has hired quite a lot of people that were not Perl programmers.
Okay, so they brought in...
They were programmers and they knew a bit of Perl.
Okay.
But they quickly learned Perl and worked for Booking.
So I guess the answer to the question is getting a Perl job, okay, or hiring Perl programmers. I think the community understands the frustration, but it's possible if you work at it, bring in smart people, you could do some training education. Perl is not hard to learn. We have tons and tons of learning tools now, and it's something that should be doable. In the end, it does come to a decision, and I understand that it can be difficult for some companies when they have hiring crunches. But I think it's a smaller problem than it used to be, and my hope is that if we continue to teach and all act like how much we act out how we love Perl, I think it will get better. Any other questions? So over there.
Where did you find your students?
Where did I find my students?
Innovation that you found with your class?
Well, I work with General Assembly. General Assembly is they're an organization in New York that does this basically is an IT incubator for. There's like a lot of like younger people interested in IT. They're either in college, they just got out of college, can't get a job. A lot of startups hang out there. It's just like a big, cool, open space, and they do presentations and they do all sorts of presentations. I approached them and said I wanted to teach a Perl class. They advertised for me, and they got the students to come in. They charged a small fee, like $200 for 8-session class. Just you don't want to make it totally free because then people don't take it seriously. But it was low. And in terms of where did my students come from, I actually felt pretty good. I had a diverse group, both demographically and gender-wise, at the class. I had one person. He was the CEO of a technology company, and he said, "My company uses PHP, but I wanted to learn some programming because my programmers laugh at me when I'm not around because they think I'm an idiot." That was his motivation. I had other people they really wanted to learn Perl because they were working in companies that use Perl and were hoping to do better at it. We had a couple of people from my company at that class as well. They were within our non-development teams that wanted to know Perl better so that they could contribute better to the company. But there was a variety of motivations. There was another. Yes, go ahead.
I was wondering how long was what was the duration?
Each class.
Time of each class?
Each class was 2 hours, and it was 8 classes. So it was 16 hours of teaching, and they paid $200. So it was a pretty good deal.
How many students was it?
It varied. I had a lot of students for the first class because they let people, I think, do the first class for $10 or something. So the first class was about 16 or 17, and the numbers went up and down. They dwindled and raised. I think on average I had about 10 or 11, which is what it is. I would have preferred to have been higher, but it wasn't terrible. I hope that it would be more next time. I think part of it was we only advertised the class for 3 weeks, and it probably could have done more to promote it. Were there other questions? Yes?
How many knew Perl but not modern Perl?
How many of them knew modern Perl?
How many knew Perl but not modern Perl?
So there was one person in the class that was had been using Perl in sort of an old school system admin capacity, and he was interested in getting a development job. So he knew Perl, but it was like what we would probably call Perl 4 kind of stuff. And he was really excited. He was one of the ones that was mostly excited about like the stuff like Plaque and Moose. He had heard of it. He had thought that it was hard, and it wasn't. It was easy. Any other questions? Sweet. Thank you all very much. And I promise I'd say it 4 times. Shutterstock is hiring. If you're interested in applying, you can talk to myself or any of the other Shutterstock people, of which several are here in this room. Thank you so much.